Even before the two Pensacola's hit the water, the U.S. Navy was having second thoughts about the weight of their main armament. The result was the 6 ships of the Northampton class. Class leader Northampton, by the way not uncoincidentally named after then-President Coolidge's hometown, was started April 28, 1928, and commissioned May 17, 1930. Chester was started March 6, 1928, and commissioned June 14, 1930. Louisville was started July 4, 1929, and commissioned January 15, 1931. Chicago was started September 10, 1928, and commissioned March 9, 1931. Houston was started May 1, 1928, and commissioned June 17, 1930. Augusta was started July 2, 1928, and commissioned January 30, 1931. By switching from a pair of triple and a pair of twin turrets to 3 triple turrets, these ships could carry 90% as many guns for only 80% of the weight. This 3 triple turret arrangement, 2 forward and 1 aft, was so successful it became the standard on all future U.S. heavy cruisers and battleships. Limited to 10,000 tons, the weight saved could be used to add a forecastle deck, keeping the ship drier and improving, but not totally fixing, the Pensacola's habit of rolling. Also for the first time in U.S. Navy history, the crews were given bunk beds instead of hammocks. Aircraft handling was improved by the addition of a double hangar, which allowed mechanics to work in a sheltered area. The first 3 were fitted as task force flagships, and the second 3 as fleet flagships. Armor protection, however, was little improved. As a result, like their predecessors, these ships were originally titled light cruisers before being retitled heavy cruisers, July 1, 1931, in compliance with the First London Naval Treaty. Also like their predecessors, due to the conservative calculations of their designers, these ships again turned out almost 1,000 tons underweight. None had any major upgrade during the war, again being too badly needed during the first year and then not worth the effort after. Improvements were limited to the standard light and medium anti-aircraft guns and better radar. The 3 that survived the war were decommissioned in mid-1946 and, after almost 15 years in reserve, were sold for scrap. Main armament was 3 triple 8-inch 55 caliber guns, 2 forward and 1 aft. Secondary armament was again 4 single, midship, open-mounted, 5-inch 25 caliber guns, with 2 mounts on either side. Propulsion was a carryover from the Pensacola's, 8 boilers in 4 rooms, with an engine room separating the forward pair from the aft, provided 107,000 horsepower to 4 shafts. This moved the ships up to 33 knots. Again, 2 triple torpedo tubes were initially fitted, but these were removed before the war. Finally, again, these ships had 2 midship catapults. With the hangar, they could operate 6 float planes, though usually no more than 4 craft were carried. While better than the Pensacola's, protection was still light for a ship of their size. The main sides peaked at 4 inches. Deck armor reached its thickest at 1.5 inches. Turret armor was up to 2.5 inches. Barbette armor was only 1.5 inches. Northampton was escorting the carrier Enterprise on its return to Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked on December 7th. She continued to escort Enterprise through the Battle of Midway. She then was with the carrier Wasp when that ship was mortally wounded by a sub on September 15, 1942. Next, she escorted the carrier Hornet in the Battle of Santa Cruz. When that carrier was mortally wounded, Northampton tried to tow her, but towing became infeasible. Finally, finding herself in a fight, Northampton took part in the overnight Battle of Tassafaronga. Hit by 2 24-inch torpedoes, Northampton's underwater protection was totally defeated. After 3 hours of firefighting and trying to control the progressive flooding, Northampton sunk by the stern. many of her survivors would go on to form the experienced crew members of the new battleship Iowa. Chester was also escorting Enterprise at the start of the war. After shooting up Tarawa, where she was slightly damaged, she returned to San Francisco. She then went to the Coral Sea, where she took part in the May 1942 Battle of the Coral Sea. Having received survivors from the sunken Lexington, she dropped them off at Tonga and headed back to the west coast for a refit that would keep her out of action through the Battle of Midway. By the end of September, she had joined the fighting around Guadalcanal. On October the 20th, 1942, she was hit amidship by a submarine torpedo. The damage wasn't fatal, but it would keep her out of the war for almost a year. Repaired by September 1943, she would spend the rest of the war escorting carriers and providing fire support. Louisville was escorting a convoy from Borneo to Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. After a quick stop, she proceeded to the west coast, where she joined the newly transferred carrier Yorktown. She escorted Yorktown on raids in the Central and South Pacific, then returned to the west coast for overhaul. In late May 1942, she headed for Alaskan waters to defend the area during the Battle of Midway, and for most of the rest of 1942. In early 1943, she was sent to the Solomons and was unable to save her sister ship from being sunk at the Battle of Reinal Island. She would again spend most of the remainder of 1943 in Alaskan waters. In January 1944, she became the flagship of Louisville native Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf. She would continue to be the flagship of his bombardment force during the Battle of the Philippine Sea and at the Battle of Surigao Strait. In January 1945, she was hit by two kamikazes that severely damaged her. She was repaired at the west coast and headed back to action around Okinawa, only to be hit again on June 5, 1945. After repairs, she would take part in the evacuation of Allied POWs. Chicago was at sea near Johnson Island, west-southwest of Hawaii, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. In February 1942, she would join up with several Australian ships to patrol the Coral Sea, taking part in the battle there in May. In August, still with the Australians, she would cover the American landings at Guadalcanal. Damaged at the nighttime Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, she would sit out the rest of the year being repaired. In late January 1943, she took part in the Battle of Reinal Island. Hit twice by torpedoes, she was badly damaged. Despite the efforts to tow her to safety and air cover from the carrier Enterprise and several escort carriers, she was hit by 4 more torpedoes and sank. Houston was the flagship of the U.S.'s Asiatic Fleet at the start of the war. Joining the Allied defense of the East Indies, she was hit by a bomb during the Battle of the Bali Sea on February 4, 1942, which burned out her aft 8-inch turret. Not giving up, she stayed in the area and took part in the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. With the Allied forces beaten in that battle, she attempted to escape to Australia via the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra with the Australian light cruiser Perth. As they approached the strait on February 28th, they came across a full-scale Japanese landing in progress. Rather than trying to escape and leaving the people of Java to be overrun unopposed, despite her number 3 turret still being out of action, they attacked. This brought in Japanese reinforcements of 2 heavy cruisers and several smaller ships. With no chance of escape and no thought of surrender, the 2 ships went down fighting. Augusta was the only U.S. heavy cruiser to spend the entire war in the Atlantic, often with the carrier Ranger. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, she was in port at Newport, Virginia. In November 1942, she took part in the North African landings as part of Operation Torch. This was followed by supporting the Normandy and then southern France invasions.